So now Aquinas' question, we've established that the natural law is going to be known by reason. It's known per se, both in its own right and as regards us. It's known per se to everybody. What exactly does the natural law say? What are its commands? What does it tell us to do or not to do? And Aquinas starts with the notion of good. So what he says is something like good, that concept, the concept of goodness, is the first thing to fall within the apprehension of practical reason. That's the way Aquinas puts the point. The idea here, what he's getting at, the most basic consideration when we're thinking about how we ought to act is going to be something like good. It's the most basic foundational value concept. It's the most basic foundational practical concept when you're thinking about what to do, what kind of life you just in the most broad general senses. Or it could be even more specific, what specifically to do, how to act, how to behave, how to live your life. All of these kinds of questions, the most basic concept, fundamental concept, foundational concept is good. That's what Aquinas is saying. And there seems to be, the idea would be that it's incredibly general, non-specific, perhaps even somewhat vague. That's kind of the idea, right? That makes it a good contender or candidate for being this most foundational basic concept. Okay, so that's his view. Good is the first thing to fall within the apprehension of practical reason. And so whenever we're thinking about what we're going to do, in some sense, it's all going to be directed at good. And he's going to say this is true even for people who do bad things. They think that what they're doing is in some sense or other good, according to Aquinas. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing, right? The thief wants to get the money from the cash register and they think that'd be good so they can go have fun or go whatever, right? They're doing it because they think there's some good that they're serving by doing it, not the common good, not the over or anything like that, but no, like I'll have a lot of fun with all this money, something like that. And so good is this very basic foundational motivating concept. What is good, though? What is the notion of good? The definition of good? The notion? Something like it's just whatever should be done. It's what should be done. And evil is just what should be avoided. Right? This doesn't take any particular stand on what specifically is good or what specifically is evil. Right? Aquinas would want to say anybody who knows what the concepts good and evil mean, knows how to use those concepts, would agree with this. Good is whatever it is you kind of should do or have a good, and evil is like what you don't want. Good is what you want. Evil is what you don't want. Good is what you should pursue. Evil is what you should avoid, right? And this is true even if you're, even a thief, even a murderer, even everybody would agree with this, right? And if they didn't, that would be a sign they didn't really understand the words good and evil, but everybody understands those words, right? And so good is like what you want and what you should do, and evil is what you should avoid and what you don't want, right? That's the notion of these subjects. This is essentially what the first precept of the natural law states. The first precept of the natural law is that good ought to be done and evil ought to be avoided. Everything in the natural law is founded upon this first precept. Everything else that we're going to find in the natural law derives from this first precept. Good ought to be done, evil ought to be avoided. And so what does the natural law command us to do? Good. Do good, avoid evil. And that's the natural law in the most basic sense. We're going to see Aquinas get more specific as we proceed. He has a particular way of making the natural law more specific, of deriving, we'll talk about it later, deriving what he calls, what I'm going to call secondary precepts from this first precept. But good ought to be done, evil ought to be avoided. And so Aquinas is going to be committed to saying that this is self-evident and known by everyone. And you might think, right, yeah, that actually kind of makes a little bit of sense. Good, yeah, do the good things. Well, of course, who would deny that? How could you deny that? Avoid the evil ones. Well, yeah, everyone knows that. Yeah, that, as far as commands go, that's got as good of a claim as being self-evident as anything I can think of, right? And so more specifically, what Aquinas would want to say is this thing, good ought to be done, evil ought to be avoided, is known per se in its own right. It's self-evident. And as regards us, everybody knows it. And both those things, you might think, yeah, seem fairly plausible. Good is simply what should be done. The notion of goodness, it's what you want. It's what should be done. It's what you should pursue. It's worthy of pursuit, worthy of choice. Good ought to be done. Pursue the good, right? That's the first precept of the natural law. That seems fairly self-evident given the notion of good. Moreover, this notion of good, it's not some technical, strange definition that only the wise, as Aquinas puts it, would grasp. It's not like human beings are rational animals, right? Good is what you should pursue, is worthy of choice. That's known by everybody. Everybody gets that. Anybody who knows how to use the concept good is going to get that. And so good ought to be done, evil ought to be avoided. It's known per se in its own right. That seems right. It's self-evident. And it's going to be known per se to everybody, because everybody who grasps the notion of good is going to be able to see that this is true. And everybody grasps the notion of good.